Federal prosecutor, you called it. You were on the program last night. You said there were real difficulties here for Donald Trump. You presumably are not surprised by the verdict.
Not at all. I mean, it's kind of was headed that way, Christian, and I think that there were two very significant points that the legal team for Ms. Carroll managed to bring. One was her contemporaneous statements to two different people at the time, and I have to think that was very powerful evidence for the jury when they heard that. The other was the fact that Donald Trump has a history of saying and even being allegedly doing things involving forcing himself on women, and of course his famous statements to Access Hollywood. So again, when you flaunt those kinds of conventions and you make it clear that you don't really respect the boundaries of other people in the law, it's not surprising when a jury then finds out that it was more likely than not that you did exactly what your accuser said you did.
The Trump team has said tonight from Mar-a-Lago that it will be appealed, but on what grounds will it be appealed? I mean,
his appeal is in sort of the public forum, right, when he says, I can't get a fair shake from a jury in New York City. But the reality is, on purely legal terms, he can try. I mean, I don't know what it would be based on. The fact that he didn't even put on a defense means that he has far fewer things to even argue about. There's far fewer procedural things to put out there because he didn't even show up to actually really put on his own defense. So I think an appeal is a long shot. I think his battle is in the political arena. As Doug said, we kind of know what he's going to say. But as far as his legal remedies, they're probably run out at this point.
Do you think there are implications? I mean, you're a federal prosecutor here. If you were still practicing, would you think there would be implications for the other cases? Because there are plenty of women who've made allegations against him.
I mean, they would have a similar uphill battle as Ms. Carroll did in the fact that they are old, perhaps not as old as her case was, going back almost 30 years. They would all be most likely, though, against civil cases. Probably all of these cases are too old to be taken in the criminal realm. So while they could pursue Donald Trump using a similar blueprint and hope to get financial penalties from him, it's unlikely that any of these, as far as we know, would lead to criminal exposure.
We're well used to the political division, and Diana's just underlined that for us. Do you worry, though, as a former federal prosecutor, about the damage the political debate is doing to the way the court is perceived and the way the jury system is perceived?
Yes, I do. Everyone is correct that we know what Donald Trump will say, and we know that a certain portion of the population will tend to agree with him and will take as fact the idea that certain juries in certain states can't be trusted. That's dangerous, okay? That's not a good thing. Regardless of your political leaning, you don't want an erosion of trust in the legal system. There's always going to be a small percentage of people who don't like the system. But if it's talking about 20%, 25% or more of voters who believe that the people that they support politically are not just who they believe in, but are victims because they can't get a fair shake in the legal system, that's not a good thing. So yes, we always want a vigorous system where we have checks and balances, but we do not want a large portion of America to believe the legal system and the justice system doesn't work.
There's a comment in the last hour about the jury and a jury in New York being the jury of peers, and in that sense they can be trusted and should be trusted. But do you have concerns about the sort of attacks we've already heard from some of those Trump supporters?
Yeah, but I'm more concerned about what Donald Trump is saying, because Donald Trump is driving this negative narrative about not getting a fair trial, about government being corrupt, about the big lie that he won the election in 2020, about the insurrection that he allegedly spurred or is being investigated, but clearly many believe he spurred that and he was impeached for his conduct there. Not just the MAGA supporters, but all of the voting population. You know, everyone has to go to the courthouse in the U.S., whether it's state or federal. It's one of the few government institutions where everyone has to go, whether you got a case, or you got to register to vote, or you've got to get a birth certificate. In the U.S., everybody's got to go to the court system. And if Donald Trump, as the president and as a leader, former president, is saying that the judiciary, that the justice system is corrupt. We're not talking about the legislature. We're not talking about the executive. Those both are kind of full of politics because they're elected officials. Some judges are elected, but for the most part, they're appointed, especially at the federal level, and they are devoid. At least we'd like to tell ourselves, and the perception is devoid of the deep politics between the decision makers. And I tend to believe that as a 36-year member of the Bar Association in this country. But when you have public officials attacking the credibility of the election system and the judiciary, it's not good. And if you take the polling on whether people trust the government or not, or trust the judicial system or not, you're going to see that there's a large percentage that don't because of the political rhetoric being put out by Donald Trump and others. And that's a huge concern. And that needs to be fixed. That means he has to be, either Donald Trump goes away, or we need to have others saying positive, independent things of support for the judiciary, because it's the only system we have of justice in this country. And listen, if you're not going to follow the laws, that's what keeps the United States the United States. That every one of us as American citizens have committed, right, to following the law, the Constitution, and abiding by the rules in this country. Without that, we have anarchy. And so that's the real danger of Donald Trump's rhetoric.
And that's the point, isn't it, Doug, that when you look at the level of damage that many people would think Donald Trump has done to the system of justice, the appointment of incompetent judges, the rigged DOJ, the obstruction of justice, the serial and ongoing attacks on the legitimacy of the court and the juries, that tests the system to the limit.
It absolutely does, and we've seen Donald Trump try and test the limits over and over again to see how far he can go and how much he can get away with. And ultimately, that's what escalated to the point of January 6th, which was a very scary day in Washington, D.C. And I'll take it a step further than Scott. Donald Trump absolutely fomented the insurrection. People marched on his orders. And Trump has learned that he could get away with that in a fashion. Yes, he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted. And obviously, he still has a political candidacy that is still viable. And he defies every bit of political gravity that we have, in part because his core base is unshakable. And we don't know, again, if his Republican challengers or those who are looking to challenge will use this as an opportunity to take him on.
Well, that's the really interesting thing, Doug, is that they've sort of skirted around the issue. The legal challenges he's faced, even his closest challenger, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, hasn't gone there at all. And you wonder at what point, given that they're not making any ground on him, they will have to go there.
I think they absolutely will. The question is, when do they move and how aggressive do they go, which leads to the other ultimate question is, will it be effective or not? And we just don't know. You know, if you remember back in 2016 when Donald Trump was a candidate, a lot of his challengers spoke out against him. They said that he wouldn't be fit to serve as president. They attacked him in great detail. Rick Perry gave a great speech, one I applauded when he made it, and it didn't matter an ounce. And Republicans are asking themselves right now, those who are looking at running, will this time be different?
You've already set out some of them. Let's just quickly go through them before we wrap. I mean, you've the criminal case over campaign payments in New York. What else? There's the Georgia case, the grand jury case in Washington. Which ones do you see the greatest legal peril for Donald Trump?
It's the classified documents kept down in Florida, and it's his involvement in instigating the January 6th riots. I think those are really the biggest dangers for him. What's interesting, though, is that this civil case that was just found today, has more of a personal element to it. And I agree with one of the prior guests that technically a civil case does not have as much exposure as these criminal cases. And yet, the fact that he was found, whether it was rape or whether it was sexual assault or battery against a woman, another human being, I think that will reverberate with people more than a lot of the Alvin Bragg case or the case about the classified documents. So I think politically a lot of damage was done to Donald Trump today. As far as his future legal travails, I mean, you know, he feeds off of it, right? He says that that's part of his sort of fighting against the machine, fighting against his political enemies. The Republican Party is going to have to really have some courage and stepping up and saying, look, do we really want our nominee to be a person so beset by legal troubles as Donald Trump?
And Scott